The rain hammered against the windshield of Maya Chen's silver Toyota Camry like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller fragments that blurred her vision of the desolate Montana highway. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white against the black leather, while her wipers struggled futilely against the torrential downpour that seemed to have emerged from nowhere. The GPS on her dashboard had lost signal 20 miles back, leaving her with nothing but the fading memory of Highway 2 stretching endlessly through Big Sky Country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya had been driving for 8 hours straight, fleeing from a life that had crumbled around her like an old building finally succumbing to gravity. The cardboard box on her passenger seat contained the remnants of her desk at Morrison Associates, where she had worked as a paralegal for 3 years until the layoffs hit last Tuesday. Pink slips had fallen like autumn leaves, and Maya's had landed with the particular cruelty reserved for single women with rent due in 5 days. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now literally lost, wandering through the wilderness of Montana with no destination in mind except away. The kitten had appeared at her apartment door that very morning, as if the universe had decided her problems needed a cherry on top. It was a tiny calico creature, no bigger than her palm, with matted fur and eyes that barely opened. Its breathing was labored, each tiny chest movement a struggle that made Maya's heart ache. She had found it curled against her doormat, so still she initially thought it was dead until she saw the faint rise and fall of its ribcage. Without thinking, she had scooped it up in a towel and placed it in a shoebox with some old t-shirts, knowing she couldn't afford a vet bill but unable to leave the creature to die. Now, as the storm raged around her car and the kitten lay silent in its makeshift bed, Maya wondered if she had simply delayed the inevitable for both of them. She had enough gas to maybe make it another 100 miles, $43 in her checking account, and nowhere to go. Her sister lived in Seattle, but they hadn't spoken since their mother's funeral 2 years ago, when grief had turned them against each other like opposing magnets. Her college friends were scattered across the country, living lives that had moved on without her while she stayed static in Minneapolis, going through the motions of existing rather than living. The storm intensified, and Maya realized she could no longer see the road markers through the wall of water cascading from the sky. Her headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead, illuminating nothing but sheets of rain that seemed to dance with malevolent purpose. She slowed to a crawl, hazard lights blinking like a distress signal in the darkness that had swallowed the afternoon whole. Lightning split the sky with the sound of the world cracking open, followed by thunder that shook her small car like a toy in the hands of an angry god. That's when her engine began to sputter. The first cough was subtle, barely noticeable over the sound of rain and wind. Maya told herself it was nothing, just the car struggling against the storm like she was. But then came the second cough, more pronounced, followed by a shuddering that seemed to emanate from the very soul of the machine. She pressed the accelerator gently, coaxing the engine to keep going, whispering promises she couldn't keep about oil changes and tune-ups and all the maintenance she had neglected while scraping together rent money. The car lurched forward another quarter mile before the engine gave one final, defeated wheeze and died completely. Maya coasted to the side of what she hoped was still the road, though in the darkness and rain, she couldn't be certain of anything anymore. She sat in the sudden silence, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain on metal and the sound of her own rapid breathing. The kitten stirred in its box, making a sound so faint it was barely audible over the storm, but it was enough to remind Maya that she wasn't just responsible for her own survival anymore. She pulled out her phone, praying for a miracle, but the screen showed no signal bars. The battery was at 12%, having been drained by her GPS attempts, and the anxious calls to her landlord that morning, trying to negotiate another week. She turned on the flashlight function, knowing she was burning precious power but needing to check on the kitten. The small creature was breathing, but its tiny form seemed even more fragile than before, and Maya felt a desperate panic rise in her chest. Lightning illuminated the landscape for a brief moment, revealing rolling hills and distant mountains that looked like sleeping giants. In that flash, Maya caught sight of something that made her heart leap with hope. Far off to her right, perhaps a mile across the field, a warm light glowed against the darkness. It was steady and golden, the kind of light that came from windows and fireplaces and the promise of human habitation. Without thinking, Maya grabbed the kitten's box and her purse, leaving everything else behind as she stepped out into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical blow, soaking through her business blazer and slacks in seconds. Her professional heels, designed for office carpets and conference rooms, immediately began sinking into the muddy ground beside the road. She kicked them off and continued barefoot, the cold mud squelching between her toes as she climbed over a wooden fence and began trudging across the field toward that distant light. Each step was a battle against the wind and rain and her own exhaustion. The box containing the kitten grew heavier with accumulated water, and Maya found herself hunching over it protectively, trying to shield the small creature from the worst of the storm. Her clothes clung to her body like a second skin, and her short black hair was plastered against her skull, sending rivulets of water down her neck and back. Lightning continued to strobe across the sky, each flash revealing her progress across the endless field, and the light that seemed to grow no closer despite her efforts. Maya's feet were numb with cold when she finally stumbled into the yard of what revealed itself to be a ranch house, built low and sturdy against the prairie winds. The warm light she had seen came from several windows that glowed like beacons in the darkness, promising warmth and shelter and the basic human kindness she desperately needed. There was a covered porch that offered the first relief from the rain she had felt in what seemed like hours, and Maya collapsed against the front door, clutching the kitten's box to her chest. She raised her fist to knock, then hesitated. What was she doing? She was a stranger appearing at someone's door in the middle of a storm, soaked to the bone and carrying a dying animal, with no money and no plan beyond the basic animal instinct to survive. What if whoever lived here thought she was dangerous? What if they turned her away? What if they called the police and she ended up arrested for trespassing with nowhere to take the kitten? But the small creature in the box made another faint sound, and Maya realized she didn't have the luxury of doubt. She knocked on the door, 3 firm raps that seemed to echo with all the desperation she felt. Then she waited, shivering in the wind that still managed to reach her even under the porch roof, listening for footsteps that would mean salvation or rejection. The footsteps came, heavy and measured, the sound of boots on hardwood floors. Maya heard the rustle of curtains being moved aside, probably someone checking to see who would be crazy enough to be out in weather like this. Then came the sound of locks being undone, and the door swung open to reveal a man who seemed to fill the entire doorframe. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out most of the light behind him. His hair was the color of wheat before harvest, tousled as if he had been running his hands through it, and his face bore the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of working outdoors. His eyes were the deep green of pine trees, and they took in Maya's bedraggled state with a mixture of surprise and concern that made her feel simultaneously grateful and mortified. But it was what he was wearing that told Maya she had found the right place. Faded blue jeans that had seen years of honest work, a flannel shirt rolled up to reveal strong forearms, and boots that were scuffed and worn but well-maintained. This was a man who worked with his hands, who understood the value of hard work and the importance of taking care of what mattered. On his wrist was a simple leather watch, and a wedding ring caught the light, making Maya wonder if she was about to meet his wife as well. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was like warm honey over gravel, touched with the faint drawl that marked him as a true son of the Mountain West. "You look like you've had some trouble." Maya opened her mouth to speak and found that her voice had abandoned her. The combination of cold and exhaustion and sheer relief at finding another human being had stolen her words. Instead, she held up the box containing the kitten, and the small creature chose that moment to make one of its faint mewing sounds. The man's expression changed immediately, his eyes focusing on the box with the intensity of someone who understood that time was precious when it came to saving lives. "Come inside," he said, stepping back and gesturing for her to enter. "Let's get you both warmed up and see what we're dealing with." Maya stepped across the threshold into warmth that felt like a physical embrace. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke and something savory cooking in a slow cooker. The living room was comfortably furnished with leather furniture that looked both sturdy and inviting, and a stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling cheerfully behind a wrought iron screen. Western art decorated the walls, paintings of horses and cattle and endless skies that captured the beauty of the land Maya had just struggled across. "I'm Jake Morrison," the man said, closing the door against the storm and turning to face her. "And you are definitely not dressed for Montana weather." "Maya Chen," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down and I saw your light, and this kitten, I found it this morning and it's sick and I don't know what to do." Jake moved closer, his eyes focused on the box in her hands. "Let me see," he said gently, and Maya found herself trusting him immediately. There was something in his manner that spoke of competence and kindness, the kind of person who would know what to do in a crisis. She lifted the lid of the box, revealing the tiny calico kitten nestled in the now damp towels. Jake's intake of breath was sharp, and Maya's heart sank, thinking he was about to confirm her worst fears about the creature's chances. Instead, he said, "She's hypothermic and dehydrated, but I've seen worse. The question is whether she's got the fight in her to pull through." He looked up at Maya, those green eyes serious but not without hope. "What's her story?" Maya told him about finding the kitten that morning, about the layoff and the eviction notice and the desperate drive west that had led her here. As she spoke, Jake listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like her words mattered, like her story was worth hearing. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "Well, Maya Chen," he said, and the way he said her name made her feel like she was someone worth knowing. "Looks like you and this little one have found your way to the right place. I've got some experience with animals that need a second chance." He moved to a cabinet and began pulling out supplies. Towels, a heating pad, something that looked like a tiny syringe. "The storm's supposed to last through the night," he said as he worked. "Your car's not going anywhere until morning at the earliest, and this kitten needs constant attention for the next several hours if she's going to make it." Maya felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, though whether from relief or exhaustion or simple gratitude, she couldn't say. "I don't have money for a vet," she said quietly. "I can't pay you for helping." Jake paused in his preparations and looked at her with an expression that was both kind and slightly amused. "Ma'am, out here we don't charge people for basic human decency. Besides," he added, gently lifting the kitten from its box and wrapping it in a clean, warm towel, "I've got a proposition for you." He settled into a chair near the fireplace, cradling the tiny animal against his chest, where his body heat could help warm it. The kitten seemed to relax slightly, though its breathing was still labored. Maya watched as Jake's large, calloused hands moved with surprising gentleness, checking the creature's pulse and examining its eyes and gums with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. "I've got a ranch to run," he continued, his voice low and soothing as he spoke to both Maya and the kitten. "Lost my ranch hand last month to a better job in Billings, and I've been trying to manage everything myself. It's a lot of work for one person, especially during calving season. I could use some help, even if it's just temporary." Maya stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. "You want me to work on your ranch? I don't know anything about ranching. I've never even been on a horse." "Everybody starts somewhere," Jake said with a slight smile. "And most ranch work isn't about riding horses anyway. It's about showing up every day, paying attention to details, and caring enough to do things right. From what I can see, you've got at least 2 of those qualities already." He adjusted the kitten's position, and Maya noticed how naturally the small creature seemed to nestle against him, as if recognizing safety when it found it. "Here's what I'm thinking," Jake continued. "You stay the night, help me keep an eye on this little one. If she makes it through until morning, if she's purring by then, it means she's got the will to live. And if you're still here when she starts purring, well, maybe that means you've got the will to start over somewhere new." Maya looked around the warm, comfortable room, at this stranger who had opened his door to her without question, at the tiny creature that had somehow led her to this moment of possibility. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, by the light of the fire, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The ranch house revealed itself slowly as Maya's eyes adjusted to the warmth and light. The living room flowed naturally into a kitchen that looked both functional and welcoming, with copper pots hanging from hooks and a large wooden table that could seat 8 people comfortably. Through a doorway she could see a hallway that presumably led to bedrooms, and everything about the space spoke of a life lived with purpose and attention to detail. Jake noticed her taking in her surroundings. "Built this place with my grandfather when I was 16, he said, gently stroking the kitten's head with one finger. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It took us 3 summers, but we did most of the work ourselves. He always said a man should know how to build the things he depends on. There was a story in those words, Maya realized. Layers of meaning about family and tradition, and the kind of rootedness she had never experienced in her own life. Her childhood had been a series of apartments and rental houses, following her mother's job changes and her father's increasingly desperate business ventures. She had never lived anywhere long enough to think of it as truly home. "Your grandfather," she said softly, settling into a chair across from Jake. "Does he still live here?" "Passed 5 years ago," Jake replied, and there was a quiet sadness in his voice that spoke of grief long carried but never fully released. "Left me the ranch and everything in it. Sometimes I still catch myself starting to call for him when something goes wrong with the equipment." The kitten stirred in Jake's arms, making a sound that was part breath and part whisper. Both adults leaned forward instinctively, watching for signs of improvement or decline. Jake reached for the small syringe he had prepared and carefully administered what Maya assumed was some kind of fluid or medication. The kitten's response was minimal, but she didn't resist, which Jake seemed to take as a positive sign. "What's in the syringe?" Maya asked. "Electrolyte solution, mostly. Same stuff they use for dehydrated calves, just a smaller dose. She's lost a lot of fluid, and her blood sugar's probably dangerously low. This should help stabilize her while her body decides whether it wants to keep fighting." Maya watched him work, impressed by his competence and the gentle confidence with which he handled the tiny animal. "You've done this before." "More times than I can count. Cattle, horses, dogs, cats, even a few wild animals that wandered onto the property hurt or sick. My grandfather always said that taking care of the creatures on your land is part of the job, whether they belong to you or not." There was a philosophy in that statement that resonated with Maya in ways she couldn't fully articulate. In her urban life, responsibility had been clearly defined and limited. She was responsible for her apartment, her job performance, her bills. The idea of feeling responsible for any creature that happened to cross her path was foreign, but strangely appealing. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, partly to keep Jake talking and partly because she was genuinely curious about this life that seemed so different from everything she had known. Jake's face brightened slightly, the way people's faces do when they're asked about something they truly care about. 3,000 acres of the most beautiful land God ever made," he said. "We run about 200 head of cattle, mostly Black Angus with some Herefords mixed in. Got about 30 horses, though most of them are working stock rather than riding horses. Grow our own hay, maintain our own water sources, fix our own equipment when it breaks down." He paused to check on the kitten again, then continued. "It's not an easy life, but it's a good one. You wake up every morning knowing exactly what needs to be done, and you go to bed every night knowing whether you did it well or not. There's no pretending, no politics, no wondering if your work matters. If you don't feed the animals, they go hungry. If you don't fix the fences, the cattle wander off. If you don't maintain the equipment, it breaks down when you need it most." Maya found herself envying the certainty in his voice, the clear sense of purpose that seemed to guide every aspect of his life. Her work as a paralegal had been important in its own way, but she had never felt the kind of direct, immediate connection between effort and result that Jake was describing. "It sounds lonely," she said, then immediately regretted the words. They seemed to imply judgment, and Jake had been nothing but kind to her. But he didn't take offense. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on the kitten, before he answered. "It can be, especially in winter, when the snow gets deep, and you might not see another person for weeks at a time. But lonely and alone aren't the same thing, you know? I've got the animals, I've got the land, I've got work that matters. Some people live in cities surrounded by millions of other people and still feel lonelier than I ever have out here." His words hit closer to home than Maya was comfortable acknowledging. She had spent the last 3 years surrounded by coworkers and neighbors and the general bustle of city life, yet she couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly connected to another person. Her relationships had been surface level, built around shared activities or professional obligations rather than genuine understanding or affection. The kitten made another soft sound, and both Maya and Jake leaned forward expectantly. This time, the sound was slightly stronger, and the tiny creature's eyes seemed to flutter open for just a moment before closing again. "That's good," Jake said with satisfaction. "She's starting to respond. The warmth and fluids are helping." Maya felt a surge of relief and something else, something that might have been maternal instinct awakening for the first time in her life. She had never wanted children, had always told herself she was too focused on her career and too uncertain about the future to take on that kind of responsibility. But watching this tiny, vulnerable creature fight for life, she felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "What happens if she doesn't make it?" Maya asked quietly. Jake's expression grew serious. "Then we'll have done everything we could, and sometimes that has to be enough. But I've got a good feeling about this one. She's got spirit, and spirit counts for a lot when it comes to surviving." He stood up carefully, making sure not to disturb the kitten, and moved toward the kitchen. "You must be freezing in those wet clothes," he said. "Let me see if I can find you something dry to wear, and then I'll make us some coffee. It's going to be a long night." Maya looked down at herself and realized that in her concern for the kitten, she had forgotten about her own discomfort. Her blazer and slacks were indeed soaked through, and she was beginning to shiver now that the immediate adrenaline of crisis had worn off. "I don't want to impose any more than I already have." "You're not imposing," Jake said firmly. "And besides, you can't help take care of this kitten if you're sick yourself. Wait here." He disappeared down the hallway, still carrying the kitten, and Maya heard the sounds of drawers opening and closing. When he returned, he was carrying a stack of clothes that looked like they would be comically large on her small frame. "These were my grandfather's," he said, setting the clothes on the table. "He was about my size, so they'll be too big, but they're clean and dry. There's a bathroom down the hall if you want to change, and I'll get the coffee started." Maya took the clothes gratefully, noting that they smelled faintly of laundry detergent and something else, something that might have been sage or pine. As she headed toward the bathroom, she heard Jake moving around the kitchen, the comfortable sounds of someone who was completely at home in his own space. The bathroom was as well maintained as the rest of the house, with clean towels and basic necessities arranged with military precision. Maya caught sight of herself in the mirror and was startled by what she saw. Her usually neat appearance was completely disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her hair plastered to her head. She looked like a refugee from some natural disaster which, she supposed, was exactly what she was. The grandfather's clothes were indeed enormous on her. The flannel shirt hung to her knees, and she had to roll the sleeves up several times to free her hands. The jeans required a belt, which Jake had thoughtfully included, and even with that, they bunched around her ankles. But the clothes were warm and soft, and smelled of honest work and fresh air, and Maya found herself feeling more comfortable than she had in months. When she returned to the living room, Jake had moved back to his chair by the fire, still cradling the kitten. A mug of coffee sat steaming on the table beside him, and he had prepared another for Maya, along with a plate of sandwiches that looked like they had been assembled from whatever was available in the kitchen. "Thank you," Maya said, settling back into her chair and wrapping her hands around the warm mug. The coffee was strong and black, the kind that could keep someone awake through a long night of watching over a sick animal. "Ham and cheese," Jake said, nodding toward the sandwiches. "Nothing fancy, but it'll keep your energy up. When did you last eat?" Maya had to think about it. The morning had been consumed with the eviction notice and packing her few belongings, and the afternoon had been spent driving with a growing sense of panic. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe breakfast yesterday." Jake's eyebrows rose. "No wonder you look ready to collapse. Eat something, and then we'll take turns watching our patient here." The sandwich was simple, but satisfying, and Maya realized as she ate how hungry she had been. Jake watched her with the kind of attention that suggested he was making sure she took care of herself, the way he might watch over any creature that had wandered onto his property in need of care. "So what's your story?" Jake asked when Maya had finished eating. "Besides the job loss and the eviction notice, What brought you to Minneapolis in the first place? Maya found herself telling him about her childhood of constant movement, her parents' divorce when she was 12, her decision to study law because it seemed like a stable career path. She talked about the paralegal job that had never quite felt like the right fit, about the relationships that had fizzled out because she had never learned how to let people truly know her, about the growing sense that she was living someone else's life rather than her own. Jake listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he was really paying attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, gently stroking the kitten's head. "Sounds like you've been looking for home your whole life without really knowing what it looks like," he said finally. The observation was so accurate it took Maya's breath away. She had never articulated it that way, but Jake had identified something she had felt, but never been able to name. She had been searching for something her entire adult life, moving from job to job and relationship to relationship without ever finding the sense of belonging she craved. "What about you?" she asked. "Have you always known this was home?" Jake smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, the expression seemed tinged with sadness. "I've never lived anywhere else, so I can't really compare. But yeah, this land, this life, it's part of who I am. My great-grandfather homesteaded here in 1892, and every generation of Morrison men has worked this same ground ever since. It's in my blood, I guess." "That must be nice," Maya said wistfully, "having that kind of continuity, that sense of belonging somewhere." "It is," Jake agreed. "But it comes with its own challenges. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have choices, to be able to pack up and start over somewhere new if things got difficult. Your life might feel uncertain, but at least you're free to reinvent yourself whenever you want." Maya considered this. She had never thought of her rootlessness as freedom, only as a source of anxiety and loneliness. But perhaps there was truth in Jake's perspective. Perhaps the ability to start over was a kind of gift, even if she had never known how to use it properly. The kitten stirred again, this time with more energy than before. Its tiny eyes opened and stayed open for several seconds, focusing on Jake's face with what seemed like recognition and trust. Maya felt her heart lift with hope. "She's improving," Jake said with satisfaction. "Her breathing is getting stronger, and she's starting to respond to stimulation. I think she's going to make it." Maya moved her chair closer so she could see the kitten better. The tiny creature was indeed looking more alert, and when Maya gently extended her finger, the kitten actually turned its head toward her touch. "What should we name her?" Maya asked impulsively. Jake looked surprised. "You planning to keep her?" Maya hadn't really thought about it, but as soon as he asked the question, she realized that the idea of abandoning the kitten now was unthinkable. This small creature had somehow become the thread connecting her old life to whatever came next. "I guess I am," she said, "if she'll have me." "Well then," Jake said, "what do you think suits her?" Maya studied the tiny calico markings, the determined way the kitten was fighting to survive, the trust it seemed to have placed in both of them. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." Jake nodded approvingly. "Hope it is." "And Hope," he said, addressing the kitten directly. "If you keep improving like this, you and Maya might just have found yourselves a place to figure out what comes next." The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the warm circle of firelight, with Hope purring faintly in Jake's arms and coffee warming her hands, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she might actually be exactly where she was supposed to be. Dawn crept across the Montana landscape like a shy child, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed impossible after the violent storm of the night before. Maya woke to find herself curled in the leather armchair by the fireplace, a wool blanket tucked around her shoulders that she didn't remember pulling over herself. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the house was filled with the kind of peaceful quiet that comes only after nature has exhausted itself in fury. Hope was purring. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. A tiny motor of contentment that filled Maya's heart with a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. Jake sat in the chair across from her, still holding the kitten, but he looked different in the morning light. The harsh angles of worry had softened from his face, replaced by the satisfied expression of a man who had fought death and won. "She started purring about an hour ago," Jake said softly, noticing that Maya was awake. "Real purrs, not just the rattling from yesterday. Her temperature's back to normal. She took some water from a dropper. and she even tried to stand up a few minutes ago. Maya stretched, working out the kinks from sleeping in the chair, and moved closer to see Hope for herself. The transformation was remarkable. The kitten's eyes were bright and alert, her breathing was steady and strong, and when Maya gently stroked her head, Hope leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. "She's really going to be okay," Maya whispered, and it wasn't a question. "More than okay," Jake replied. "She's got the kind of spirit that doesn't just survive, it thrives. Given the right care and environment, she'll grow into a fine cat." The implication in his words wasn't lost on Maya. The kitten would need ongoing care, a stable home, someone who would be there consistently to provide food and attention, and the security that came with belonging somewhere. In her old life, Maya wouldn't have been able to provide any of those things. Her apartment had a strict no-pets policy, her work schedule had been unpredictable, and her own life had been too unstable to take responsibility for another living creature. But sitting here in Jake's living room, watching Hope respond to their combined care, Maya felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. She wanted this responsibility. More than that, she needed it. Caring for Hope had awakened something in her that had been dormant for so long she had forgotten it existed. "The storm's past," Jake observed, nodding toward the windows where brilliant sunshine was streaming through glass that had been lashed by rain just hours before. "I should go check on the livestock, make sure everyone weathered it okay. Would you like to come with me?" Hope seemed stable enough to travel in her carrier for a short trip. Maya nodded eagerly. She had been curious about ranch life from the moment Jake had described it the night before, and the idea of seeing his world in daylight was appealing. More than that, she realized she wasn't ready to be separated from either Jake or Hope, even for the brief time it would take him to complete his morning chores. Jake prepared a proper carrier for Hope, lined with soft towels and equipped with tiny water and food dishes. The kitten protested briefly when transferred from Jake's arms to the carrier, but settled quickly when she realized she could still see both humans through the mesh sides. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed by the storm and filled with the sense of wet earth and growing things. Maya breathed deeply, feeling her lungs expand with air that seemed somehow more substantial than what she had been breathing in Minneapolis. Everything looked impossibly green and alive, from the grass that sparkled with dewdrops to the trees that swayed gently in the aftermath breeze. Jake's truck was a working vehicle, practical rather than pretty, with toolboxes bolted to the bed and mud on the tires that spoke of regular use in less than ideal conditions. Maya climbed into the passenger seat, holding Hope's carrier carefully on her lap, while Jake started the engine with the ease of long familiarity. They drove across fields that seemed to stretch to the horizon, past ponds that reflected the morning sky like mirrors, and through gates that Jake opened and closed with the automatic movements of someone who had performed the same actions thousands of times. Maya found herself mesmerized by the vastness of it all, by the sense of space and possibility that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath them. The cattle were gathered in a pasture near a creek, and Maya was struck by how peaceful they looked after surviving the same storm that had nearly broken her. They were massive animals, much larger than she had imagined, but they moved with a calm dignity that suggested they were exactly where they belonged. "Black Angus," Jake explained as he parked the truck and began walking toward the herd. "Best beef cattle you can raise, and they're hardy enough to handle whatever weather Montana throws at them. These particular animals have been through drought, blizzards, and everything in between, and they just keep on doing what cattle do." Maya followed him, still carrying Hope, and watched as Jake moved among the animals with an easy confidence that spoke of years of experience. He checked each cow with practiced efficiency, running his hands along their sides and looking into their eyes, murmuring reassurances in a voice that seemed to calm even the most skittish among them. "What are you looking for?" Maya asked, genuinely curious about the process. "Signs of injury or illness, mostly. That storm was violent enough to spook them, and spooked cattle sometimes hurt themselves trying to find shelter. Plus, I want to make sure none of them are showing signs of stress that might affect their pregnancy." "They're pregnant?" Jake grinned, and Maya realized it was the first time she had seen him look genuinely happy rather than just kind or concerned. "About half of them are carrying calves that'll be born this spring. It's the best part of ranching, watching new life come into the world. Every calf that's born healthy represents the future of this operation." Maya found herself thinking about futures and new beginnings as she watched Jake work. There was something profound about the way he talked about the cattle, not just as livestock but as individuals whose welfare mattered to him personally. She had never experienced that kind of connection to her work, that sense that what she did each day had meaning beyond a paycheck. They moved on to check the horses next, and Maya was surprised by how different they were from the romanticized versions she had seen in movies. These were working animals, sturdy and practical rather than beautiful, though there was a kind of beauty in their functionality. They came when Jake called, clearly accustomed to his voice and presence, and allowed him to examine them with the patient resignation of creatures who understood that such attention was for their own good. Hope had been quiet during the truck ride and the walk among the cattle, but the horses seemed to fascinate her. She pressed her tiny face against the mesh of her carrier, watching with bright eyes as the large animals moved around them. One particularly curious mare approached the carrier and snuffled gently at it, causing Hope to purr with excitement. "She likes them," Jake observed with amusement. Cats and horses often get along well. Something about their independent natures, I think. They respect each other's boundaries. Maya wondered if there was a lesson in that observation. Something about the way relationships worked best, when both parties maintained their individual identity while choosing to share space and resources. Her past relationships had always felt like negotiations, with both parties trying to change the other into someone more compatible. Perhaps the secret was finding someone whose natural way of being complemented your own, rather than conflicted with it. They spent the rest of the morning touring the ranch, and Maya began to understand the scope of Jake's daily responsibilities. There were fences to check and repair, water systems to maintain, equipment to service, and a dozen other tasks that required both physical strength and technical knowledge. It was the kind of work that demanded complete attention and offered immediate feedback, the opposite of the bureaucratic maze she had navigated as a paralegal. "It's a lot to manage alone," Maya commented as they headed back toward the house for lunch. Jake was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel as he navigated a rutted section of road. "It is," he admitted finally. "My grandfather always said a ranch this size really needs 2 full-time people to run it properly, 3 during busy seasons like calving and haying. I've been trying to do it all myself since my hand left, but there are some things that just work better with help." Maya sensed there was more to the story, layers of meaning in his carefully neutral tone that spoke of challenges he hadn't fully shared. "Why did your ranch hand leave?" "Better opportunity in Billings. Can't blame him for that. Tommy was young, had a girlfriend in the city, wanted to make more money than I could afford to pay him. Ranch work doesn't make anyone rich, and it's not an easy life for someone who's not committed to it." The house felt like a sanctuary when they returned, warm and welcoming after the morning spent outdoors. Jake prepared lunch, while Maya tended to Hope, who was showing more energy with each passing hour. The kitten had managed to eat a small amount of soft food and was even attempting to groom herself, tiny pink tongue working with determined efficiency. "She's really remarkable," Maya said, watching Hope's efforts with admiration. "Last night I thought we were going to lose her, and now look at her." "Animals have an advantage over humans sometimes," Jake replied from the kitchen where he was assembling sandwiches. "They don't waste energy worrying about what might happen. They just focus on what they need to do right now to survive and thrive." Maya considered this observation as she gently stroked Hope's fur. Perhaps that was part of what had gone wrong in her own life. Too much energy spent on anxiety about the future and regret about the past, not enough attention paid to the present moment and what it required of her. Lunch was simple fare, roast beef sandwiches and homemade soup that tasted like it had been simmering all morning. They ate in comfortable silence, both tired from the emotional intensity of the night and the physical activity of the morning. Hope dozed in her carrier, occasionally opening one eye to check that her humans were still nearby before settling back into sleep. "I should probably call about my car," Maya said eventually, though the words felt heavy with reluctance. Dealing with her broken-down vehicle meant confronting the reality of her situation, making decisions about what came next. "Phone's on the kitchen counter," Jake said. "Though you should know that Pete's auto is the only garage in 50 miles, and Pete doesn't work on Sundays. Earliest he could look at your car would be Monday morning." Maya felt a complicated mix of relief and anxiety at this news. Part of her was glad for the reprieve, the excuse to stay in this peaceful place a little longer. But another part of her was acutely aware that she was imposing on Jake's hospitality, taking advantage of his kindness without having anything to offer in return. "I can't keep staying here," she said quietly. "You've already done so much for me and Hope. I don't want to wear out my welcome." Jake leaned back in his chair and studied her with those green eyes that seemed to see more than most people revealed. "What exactly are you planning to go back to in Minneapolis?" he asked gently. "You said you were evicted from your apartment and laid off from your job. Where would you go if your car was running perfectly right now?" The question hit Maya like a physical blow, because it forced her to confront what she had been avoiding thinking about since the moment she had started driving west. She had no home to return to, no job waiting for her, no relationships that would survive her extended absence. Her old life hadn't just fallen apart, it had essentially ceased to exist. "I don't know," she admitted, and the words felt like a confession of complete failure. "I guess I was just running, hoping I'd figure something out along the way." "There's nothing wrong with running when you need to," Jake said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes it's the only way to get enough distance from a situation to see it clearly. But eventually you have to stop running and decide where you want to make your stand." Maya looked around the kitchen, at the evidence of a life lived with intention and purpose, then down at Hope sleeping peacefully in her carrier. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she could imagine a different kind of future, one built around caring for something beyond herself. "What if I wanted to make my stand here?" she asked, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her courage. "You said you needed help with the ranch work. I don't know anything about cattle or horses, but I'm a fast learner, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Maya felt her heart racing as she waited for his response. She had just propositioned a virtual stranger, suggesting she abandon her old life entirely to try something completely foreign to her experience. It was either the bravest thing she had ever done, or the most foolish. "Ranch work isn't romantic," Jake said finally. "It's early mornings and late nights, 7 days a week. It's hot in summer and brutally cold in winter. It's dealing with sick animals and broken equipment and weather that doesn't care about your plans. You get dirty every day, and some days you get hurt. The pay isn't great, and there's no guarantee of success." Maya listened to his litany of warnings and found that none of them diminished her interest. If anything, the honesty made her more certain that this was what she wanted. She had spent too many years in a job that felt meaningless, dealing with problems that seemed artificial and solutions that helped no one but corporate clients. The idea of work that mattered, even if it was difficult, was appealing rather than daunting. "What would you expect from a ranch hand?" she asked. "Besides the obvious things like showing up and working hard." "Reliability above everything else," Jake answered without hesitation. "Animals depend on you, and they don't understand why you might not show up one day. Attention to detail, because small problems become big problems fast if you don't catch them early. Willingness to learn, because there's always something new to figure out. And commitment, because this isn't the kind of work you can do half-heartedly." Maya thought about her years as a paralegal, the skills she had developed that might translate to ranch work. Attention to detail had been crucial in legal work, and she had always prided herself on thoroughness. She had learned to work independently, to prioritize multiple tasks, to remain calm under pressure. Perhaps those abilities would serve her well in a different context. "What about living arrangements?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual even though the answer would determine whether her tentative plan was even feasible. "There's a small cabin about half a mile from the main house," Jake said. "Built it for the ranch hand position. It's not fancy, but it's got everything you'd need. Running water, electricity, a wood stove for heat. Tommy kept it clean, so it's ready for someone to move in." Maya felt a flutter of excitement at the thought of having her own space, a place where she could create the kind of home she had never been able to establish in her series of temporary apartments. The cabin sounded perfect, small enough to be manageable but independent enough to preserve both her dignity and Jake's privacy. Hope stirred in her carrier and made a small sound that brought both adults' attention back to her. The kitten was awake and looking around with bright, curious eyes that held no trace of the lethargy that had worried them so much the night before. When Maya opened the carrier and lifted Hope out, the tiny creature immediately began purring, a sound that was stronger and more sustained than anything they had heard from her before. "Well, Hope," Maya said, holding the kitten close to her chest, What do you think? Should we stay and learn to be ranch cats? Hope responded by curling up against Maya's neck and purring even louder, a sound of contentment that seemed to express perfect satisfaction with the arrangement. Jake laughed, the first genuinely carefree sound Maya had heard from him since they met. I think that's her vote, he said. But there's something else you should know before you make your final decision. Maya's heart skipped, wondering what complication he was about to reveal. What's that? I wasn't entirely honest last night about why my ranch hand left for Billings, Jake said, his expression growing serious again. Tommy did get a better job offer, but he also left because he thought I was too stubborn and set in my ways to run a successful operation. He wasn't entirely wrong. Maya waited for him to continue, sensing that this admission was important and difficult for him to make. This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations, Jake went on, and every generation has done things pretty much the same way. Traditional methods, conservative choices, resistance to change even when change might be beneficial. Tommy wanted to modernize, try new approaches, invest in technology that might make us more efficient and profitable. I resisted because it felt like betraying the legacy my grandfather left me. But you're reconsidering? Maya prompted gently. I'm starting to think that maybe the best way to honor that legacy is to make sure the ranch survives and thrives, even if that means doing some things differently. Tommy had good ideas, I just wasn't ready to hear them. If you decide to stay, I want you to know that I'm open to suggestions, to trying new approaches if they make sense. Maya felt a surge of excitement at the possibility of not just working on the ranch but potentially contributing to its evolution and success. Her business background might actually be relevant in ways she hadn't initially considered. She had experience with budgeting, project management, problem-solving, and research. Perhaps she could bring a fresh perspective to challenges Jake had been facing alone. What kind of new approaches was Tommy suggesting? She asked. Better record-keeping systems, for one thing. Right now I track everything on paper, the way my grandfather did. But Tommy thought we should computerize the records to spot trends and make better decisions about breeding and feeding. He also wanted to explore direct marketing to consumers. Instead of just selling cattle at auction, maybe start a small meat business that would bring in better prices. Maya's mind immediately began spinning with possibilities. These were exactly the kinds of projects that would benefit from her organizational skills and attention to detail. She could see herself researching markets, developing business plans, creating systems that would help Jake make informed decisions about the ranch's future. Those sound like smart ideas, she said carefully, not wanting to seem too eager or presumptuous. I don't know anything about cattle, but I do know something about business planning and organization. If you decided to pursue any of those projects, I'd be interested in helping. Jake studied her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was reading her soul. You're serious about this, aren't you? This isn't just a romantic notion brought on by a traumatic night and a cute kitten. Maya considered the question honestly, examining her own motivations and the practical realities of what she was contemplating. The truth was that it did feel romantic and impulsive, but it also felt more right than anything she had ever considered doing with her life. I'm serious, she said firmly. I know it seems crazy, and maybe it is. But I've spent the last 3 years being practical and playing it safe, and where did that get me? Unemployed, homeless, and driving through a storm with no destination in mind. Maybe it's time to try being brave instead of sensible. Jake nodded slowly, and Maya thought she saw respect in his eyes along with something that might have been hope. All right then. If you're willing to try, I'm willing to let you. We'll call it a trial period, see how we both feel about the arrangement after a month or 2. I'll pay you what I paid Tommy, provide housing and utilities, and we'll evaluate how things are working as we go. Maya felt a wave of relief and excitement so strong it was almost overwhelming. For the first time since she had gotten the pink slip at Morrison Associates, she had a plan that felt like moving forward rather than just surviving from day to day. When would you want me to start? She asked. Tomorrow morning if you're up for it. Ranch work starts early, usually around 6, and there's always plenty to do. I'll spend the first few days showing you the basics. Then we'll see what you have a natural aptitude for. Maya looked down at Hope, who was still purring contentedly against her chest, then around the kitchen, that was already beginning to feel familiar and welcoming. Tomorrow she would begin learning skills she had never imagined needing, working with animals she had never interacted with, building a life in a place she had never planned to visit. It should have felt terrifying, but instead it felt like coming home. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, she repeated, testing the words and finding she liked the sound of them. I'll be ready. As if to seal the agreement, Hope chose that moment to stretch her tiny paws and touch Maya's face with one delicate pink pad, purring loudly enough that Jake could hear it from across the table. Outside, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly under an afternoon sky that promised clear weather ahead, and Maya Chen allowed herself to believe that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected directions. 6 weeks later, Maya stood in the early morning darkness outside the cattle barn, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she checked her watch. 5:45 in the morning, and she was already dressed and ready for the day ahead. The transformation from city office worker to ranch hand hadn't happened overnight. But somewhere between learning to muck stalls and discovering she had an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior, Maya had found herself becoming someone she barely recognized. Hope sat perched on a fence post nearby, now grown into a sleek young cat with bright amber eyes and a coat that gleamed with health. She had appointed herself supervisor of Maya's morning routines, following along on the daily rounds with the dignity of someone who understood her importance to the operation. The kitten who had nearly died in a storm had become a confident feline who seemed to consider the entire ranch her personal domain. Jake emerged from the barn carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, a morning ritual they had developed without discussion. He handed one to Maya and took his place beside her at the fence, both of them looking out over the pasture where the cattle were beginning to stir in the pre-dawn light. "Weather report says we might get snow tonight," Jake said, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone who no longer had to choose his words carefully. "First real snow of the season. You ready for winter ranch work?" Maya smiled, remembering how intimidated she had been by the prospect of Montana weather when she first arrived. Now she understood that weather was simply another factor to plan for, like equipment maintenance or animal health. You prepared for what you could predict and adapted to what you couldn't. "I've got the extra hay moved to the close pastures, and I checked all the water heaters yesterday. The cattle are in good shape, and we've got enough feed stored to last through any storm the weather wants to throw at us." Jake nodded approvingly. Maya had learned that his praise was rarely vocal, but always evident in the trust he placed in her judgment and the responsibilities he gradually shifted to her capable hands. She had proven herself not just willing to learn, but naturally gifted at reading the subtle signs that meant the difference between healthy livestock and potential problems. The past 6 weeks had been a revelation in more ways than Maya could have anticipated. The physical work had been challenging at first, her soft office hands developing calluses and her sedentary muscles adapting to long days of lifting, walking, and manual labor. But her body had grown strong and capable, and she had discovered reserves of endurance she never knew she possessed. More importantly, she had found a sense of purpose that had been missing from her previous life. Every task on the ranch had immediate, visible results. When she repaired a fence, cattle stayed where they belonged. When she maintained the water systems, animals had clean drinking water. When she monitored the pregnant cows, she could spot potential complications before they became emergencies. The work mattered in a direct, tangible way that made every day feel meaningful. "I've been thinking about those records Tommy wanted to computerize," Maya said, sipping her coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "I spent some time last weekend researching livestock management software, and I think I found a system that might work for us." Jake turned to look at her with the expression of someone who was no longer surprised by her initiative but remained pleased by it. Over the weeks, Maya had gradually introduced small improvements to ranch operations, always with Jake's approval, but increasingly with his active encouragement. She had reorganized the supply storage system, created a maintenance schedule for equipment, and developed a more efficient rotation plan for the pastures. "What kind of system?" "It's designed specifically for cattle ranches our size. It would let us track individual animal health records, breeding cycles, weight gains, and feed efficiency. More importantly, it can generate reports that would help us make better decisions about which animals to keep for breeding and which ones to market." Maya pulled out her phone and showed Jake the information she had compiled, complete with cost analyses and implementation timelines. It was the kind of thorough preparation that came naturally to her, the same attention to detail that had made her a competent paralegal now applied to ranch management. The initial investment is significant, she continued, but I ran the numbers based on our current herd size and production levels. If the system helps us improve our breeding success rate by even 5%, it would pay for itself within 2 years. Jake studied the information with the careful attention he gave to all business decisions. Maya had learned that his apparent conservatism wasn't resistance to change, but rather the caution of someone who understood that poor choices could threaten the survival of an operation that supported not just him, but an entire way of life. What about the learning curve? Neither of us has much experience with livestock management software. The company provides training and technical support for the first year. Plus, I've been reading about similar systems, and the principles are pretty straightforward. It's mostly a matter of entering data consistently and learning to interpret the reports. Maya hesitated, then decided to share the broader vision that had been taking shape in her mind over the past few weeks. I've also been researching the direct marketing ideas Tommy mentioned. There are several successful ranch-to-consumer operations in Montana that are selling premium beef directly to restaurants and individual customers. She could see Jake's interest sharpening, the way it did when they discussed improvements that could strengthen the ranch's long-term viability. Maya had come to understand that his attachment to traditional methods wasn't stubbornness, but love, the desire to preserve something precious while ensuring it could survive in a changing world. The profit margins are significantly higher than selling through auction, Maya continued, but it requires more work on our end. We'd need to develop relationships with local restaurants, create marketing materials, handle processing and delivery logistics. It's essentially running 2 businesses instead of 1. But you think it's doable? Maya looked out over the pasture where the cattle grazed peacefully, healthy animals that represented years of careful breeding and husbandry. She thought about the pride she had seen in Jake's face when he talked about the ranch's history, and the quiet satisfaction she felt when evening came and she knew every animal on the property was safe and well cared for. I think it's worth trying, she said firmly. We could start small, maybe approach 2 or 3 restaurants in Bozeman, and see how they respond to the idea of locally sourced, grass-fed beef. If there's interest, we could gradually expand the program. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on Hope, who had jumped down from the fence post and was weaving between his legs with the shameless affection of a cat who knew she was beloved. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been excitement. Tommy had the right ideas, but he wanted to implement everything at once. Your approach makes more sense, testing one concept at a time and building on what works. Maya felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the coffee in her hands. Over the weeks, she had earned Jake's respect through competence and reliability, but moments like this, when he sought her opinion and trusted her judgment, still filled her with pride. There's something else, Jake said, his tone shifting to something more personal. I've been thinking about our arrangement, about what happens when your trial period is officially over next week. Maya's heart skipped, though she wasn't sure whether from anxiety or anticipation. The trial period had been Jake's idea, a way for both of them to evaluate the arrangement without making commitments that might prove difficult to change. But somewhere over the past 6 weeks, Maya had stopped thinking of this as temporary employment and begun thinking of it as home. I know you've probably been wondering about that too, Jake continued. And I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, there's no question about your staying on permanently if that's what you want. You've proven yourself 10 times over, and I can't imagine running this place without you anymore. Relief flooded through Maya so powerfully that she had to grip the fence rail to steady herself. She had tried not to think about the possibility of having to leave, of returning to a life that no longer fit her, but the fear had been there nonetheless, a shadow at the edge of her newfound happiness. I want to stay, she said, the words coming out more breathlessly than she had intended. This place, this work, it's become everything to me. I can't imagine being anywhere else. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face with warmth that reached all the way to his eyes. Good. Because I have a proposition for you, something beyond just being my ranch hand. Maya waited, her pulse quickening with curiosity and something that felt like hope. I've been thinking about the direct marketing idea, about expanding the operation and trying some of the innovations you've suggested. But that kind of growth requires capital investment and business expertise that I don't have. What I do have is land, livestock, and 40 years of experience raising cattle." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, and Maya realized that whatever he was about to propose was important enough to make him nervous. "What if we made this a true partnership? You bring your business skills and organizational abilities, I contribute the ranch and my knowledge of livestock management, and we build something bigger than either of us could create alone." Maya stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. A partnership meant more than employment. It meant shared ownership, shared risk, and shared reward. It meant Jake trusted her not just with daily tasks, but with the future of something that represented 4 generations of his family's legacy. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dead serious. I've watched you over these past weeks, and I've seen how much you care about this place, how hard you work to make everything better. You're not just doing a job, you're invested in the success of this operation in a way that goes beyond collecting a paycheck." Jake reached down to scratch Hope behind the ears, and the cat purred loudly enough to be heard over the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. Besides, Hope here has made it clear that she considers this her permanent residence. I'd hate to disappoint her by letting her favorite human leave. Maya laughed through tears she hadn't realized were forming, overwhelmed by the generosity of Jake's offer and the trust it represented. 6 weeks ago, she had been a stranger fleeing a life that had collapsed around her, carrying nothing but a dying kitten and desperate hope. Now she was being offered a chance to help build something lasting and meaningful. "What would a partnership look like?" she asked, wanting to understand the practical implications, even as her heart was already saying yes. "We'd need to work out the legal details, but basically you'd have an ownership stake in the ranch proportional to your contribution and investment. We'd be equal partners in decision-making, profit-sharing, and future growth. If you want to pursue some of those marketing ideas, we'd do it together, with shared risk and shared success." Maya thought about the life she had abandoned in Minneapolis, the apartment she couldn't afford, and the job that had never satisfied her. Then she looked around at the ranch that had become home, at the animals she had learned to care for, at the man who had become not just her employer but her friend, and now potential business partner. "Yes," she said, the word coming out strong and clear. "Yes, I want to be your partner." Jake extended his hand, and when Maya shook it, she felt like she was sealing not just a business agreement, but a commitment to a future she had never imagined but now couldn't imagine living without. As if in celebration, Hope jumped onto the fence rail and began purring with such enthusiasm that both humans laughed. The sun had fully risen now, painting the Montana landscape in brilliant gold and casting long shadows across pastures where cattle grazed peacefully under an endless sky. 3 months later, Maya stood in the kitchen of what was now her home as much as Jake's, preparing dinner while Hope supervised from her favorite perch on the windowsill. The direct marketing program had launched successfully, with 3 Bozeman restaurants now featuring Morrison Ranch beef on their menus. The livestock management software had been installed and was already providing valuable insights into herd productivity. Most importantly, the ranch felt like a thriving, growing operation rather than just a legacy being preserved. Maya heard Jake's truck pulling into the yard, returning from a delivery to their newest restaurant client, and she felt the familiar surge of contentment that came with knowing her partner was safely home after a day of shared work toward shared goals. Hope jumped down from the windowsill and headed for the door, ready to greet Jake with the enthusiastic welcome she reserved for the humans who had saved her life and made her part of a family. As Jake came through the door, bringing with him the sense of hay and winter air, Maya reflected on the strange journey that had led her to this moment. A storm, a broken car, a dying kitten, and the kindness of a stranger had somehow combined to give her everything she had been searching for without knowing it existed. "How did the delivery go?" Maya asked, turning from the stove to greet Jake with a smile that felt as natural as breathing. "Perfect. Chef Rodriguez wants to increase his weekly order, and he's talking about featuring our beef in a special menu for Valentine's Day." Jake scooped up Hope, who immediately began purring and rubbing against his chin, then moved to stand beside Maya at the stove. Looking down at the woman who had transformed his ranch and his life, he marveled at the way unexpected blessings sometimes arrived in the most unlikely packages. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first flakes of winter drifting past the kitchen window like promises of the season ahead. Inside, the house was warm, with the heat of the wood stove and the deeper warmth of a home where three souls who had found each other were building a life together, one day at a time. Maya-chan had driven into a storm with no destination in mind, carrying nothing but desperation and a dying kitten. She had found a sanctuary, a purpose, and a partnership that fulfilled her in ways she had never thought possible. As she watched the snow fall and listened to Hope purr in Jake's arms, she understood that sometimes the best journeys were the ones that began with no plan at all, guided only by hope and the courage to trust in unexpected kindness. The ranch stretched endlessly beyond the warm circle of kitchen light, vast and beautiful, and full of possibilities. Tomorrow there would be cattle to tend, and plans to make, and a future to build together. But tonight there was this: home, family, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that they had all found exactly where they belonged. Hope purred louder, as if she understood that she had been the catalyst for everything that followed, the tiny heart that had brought two lost souls together and given them reason to believe in second chances. Outside, the Montana winter was settling over the land, but inside, spring was eternal, full of growth and promise, and the endless possibility of love taking root in the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.